Picture this. You are standing in the greatest museum in the world, golden statues towering over you, walls covered in hieroglyphs, the smell of old stone and ancient wood, and every label you read, every display you walk past tells you the same story. Egypt was glorious. Egypt was eternal. Egypt was built by gods who walked as men. But here's the thing nobody tells you in that museum. The most powerful era in Egyptian history, the New Kingdom, the era that gave us Ramesses the Great, Tutankhamun's golden mask, and the Valley of the Kings, was not built by glory. It was built in shadow, by two men whose names most people cannot even pronounce, men whose bones are contested, whose monuments are fragmented, whose legacies were deliberately buried by the very empire they created. And by the end of this video, I promise you, once you see what these men actually did and how they actually did it, you will never look at the golden age of Egypt the same way again. Because the real story of Thutmose I and Ramesses I is not a story of gods. It is a story of cold, calculated, ruthless political genius, and it starts with a broken throne. Before we talk about who these men were, we need to feel the world they inherited. Close your eyes for just a moment. You have heard the story of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the Sphinx, infinite power, eternal gods, a civilization so perfect it seemed to defy time itself. That is the story they carved into the stone. That is the story they wanted you to believe. But here is the truth hiding beneath that story. Egypt collapsed, not once, not quietly, it shattered. Around 1650 BC, a people called the Hyksos, powerful foreign rulers from the northeast, swept into the Nile Delta and seized control of Lower Egypt. For over 100 years, pharaohs ruled from the shadows of a divided, humiliated kingdom. The old order was gone. The divine bloodline was broken. The empire that was supposed to last forever had cracked right down the middle. And when the new kingdom finally began, when Egyptian rulers bled and fought to take back their land, what they inherited was fragile in ways that no golden statue could ever show you. Here is what most people miss. A throne that has been broken once can always be broken again. And the men who sit on it after the crisis know that more than anyone. Every decision, every campaign, every monument, every carved inscription, it is not tradition, it is not ceremony, it is survival. And into this world, this anxious, fractured, desperate world, stepped two men who would hold it together by sheer force of will. But here is the question that has haunted Egyptologists for decades. How do you hold an empire together when you have no right to rule it? Stay with me, because the answer is darker than anything written on the walls. Let me tell you about Thutmose I. He ruled Egypt from approximately 1506 to 1493 BC, though scholars still debate the exact dates. He commanded armies that stretched the Egyptian empire further than it had ever reached before. He built the first royal tomb ever cut into what would become the Valley of the Kings, and he was not supposed to be king at all. When Pharaoh Amenhotep I died without a male heir, the royal bloodline ended, just like that. The divine succession, the unbroken chain connecting every pharaoh back to the gods, snapped. And in that moment of crisis, the court made a decision that would echo for centuries. They handed the double crown to a soldier. Think about what that actually means. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not just a ruler, he was a living god. The physical embodiment of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. The glue that held the universe together. Ma'at. Without it, the Nile floods wrong. The harvests fail. The gods turn away. Without it, the world falls apart. And now, the man sitting on that throne, the man responsible for maintaining Ma'at for the entire known world, was a military general with no royal blood, no genealogy connecting him to the gods, no divine right, just a very sharp mind and a very sharp sword. How do you manufacture the legitimacy you were never given? How do you make millions of people believe you are the son of Ra when everyone in the palace knows you are the son of a soldier? Pay attention. Because this is where Thutmose I did something so calculated, so precise, that modern political strategists would recognize it immediately. He did not try to claim divine blood, he manufactured divine victory, south into Nubia, beyond the fourth cataract of the Nile, deep into territory no previous pharaoh had reached. Thutmose marched his armies. His own records describe watching the Nile flow in the wrong direction, marveling at a land so foreign it seemed like another world. Then north, into Syria, across the Euphrates River, into land that no Egyptian king had ever touched. There, on the banks of the Euphrates, in a foreign country, surrounded by soldiers who had never seen Egypt, Thutmose I planted a victory stele, a stone monument carved with his name, a permanent inscription saying, "I was here, I conquered this, I am Pharaoh." And here is what that stele actually was. It was not a military record, it was a political performance. Every campaign, every monument, every inscription Thutmose carved was a piece of carefully staged theater designed to do one thing: make the empire forget that he was never supposed to have the throne. And it worked. But here's where this gets stranger. In 1881, a team of Egyptian archaeologists made one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of Egyptology. Hidden inside a secret cache cut into the cliffs near Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of the Nile, they found a sealed chamber that had not been opened in nearly 3,000 years. Inside it, the mummified remains of some of the greatest pharaohs who ever lived. Moved there in antiquity by priests trying to protect the royal dead from tomb robbers, the cache contained names that stopped archaeologists cold: Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Ramesses the Great, and a mummy long associated with Thutmose I. Now here is where the official story starts to unravel, because when modern scientists performed physical analysis on this mummy, the results created more questions than they answered. The body appeared to be that of a relatively young man, estimated somewhere between 30 and 50 years of age at the time of death. But the historical record, the building projects, the military campaigns, the administrative achievements attributed to Thutmose I suggests a reign long enough that this age does not quite fit. So here are the possibilities. Either the dating of the mummy is wrong, or the body is not actually Thutmose I, or, and this is what quietly circulates among some researchers, the official record of his reign was manipulated after his death by a successor who needed to rewrite history. Modern CT imaging has transformed what we know about the royal dead. These scans reveal old fractures and healed injuries. They show the physical wear of decades of military life. They read the body as a document, a record of a life that the hieroglyphs sometimes deliberately obscure. And what these skeletal remains show, whoever this king truly was, is a body shaped by physical extremity, dense muscle attachment points, evidence of repeated physical stress, the architecture of someone who lived and perhaps died in motion, not the bones of a palace child, the bones of a man who built a kingdom with his own hands. And when you cross-reference those physical clues with the fragmentary stelae that survived from Thutmose's reign, a picture emerges that official history struggles to contain. This was a man who understood one thing above all others: that in a fragile empire image is everything, and that someone at some point after his death felt threatened enough by that image to start quietly erasing it. Now I need to introduce you to the second Shadow King, because if Thutmose I was the outsider general who seized legitimacy through military theater, then Ramesses I was something even more extraordinary. He was an elderly man handed a dying dynasty, and given less than 2 years to save it. By around 1295 BC, Egypt was bleeding from the inside. The reign of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who had tried to erase Egypt's traditional gods entirely, replacing 3,000 years of religion with a single deity called the Aten, had fractured the country spiritually, economically, and politically. After Akhenaten came Tutankhamun, the boy king who died before he could rule. After Tutankhamun came I, an aging court official who held power briefly. After I came Horemheb, a military general who seized the throne and spent his reign systematically erasing Akhenaten's memory from every stone surface in Egypt. Are you noticing the pattern? Every time the royal bloodline broke, Egypt turned to its military. But Horemheb had no son, no heir, no bloodline to continue. So at the very end of his reign, with the clock running out, he did something that sounds almost reckless. He appointed his vizier, his chief minister, his top administrator, as the next pharaoh of Egypt. That vizier was an elderly man named Paramessu. He would be crowned as Ramesses I, and he would rule for less than 2 years, 16 to 18 months. By most historical estimates, that is all he had. 16 to 18 months to establish a dynasty that would last for over a century. 16 to 18 months to signal stability to a traumatized population. 16 to 18 months to build the foundation for an empire that would produce warriors, builders, and conquerors whose names we still speak today. And here is where the genius of Ramesses I becomes clear. He could not conquer territory. He was too old and his reign too short. He could not build great monuments. There was no time. What he could do, what he immediately, precisely, relentlessly did, was position. Within months of taking the throne, he elevated his son Seti to co-regent. Not just an heir, an active, empowered co-ruler, a signal to the empire that power was already transferring smoothly. He began construction on a mortuary temple at Abydos, Egypt's most sacred city, the home of Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, connecting himself symbolically to the deepest roots of Egyptian religious tradition. He issued administrative decrees with the precision of a man who had spent decades running the machinery of government. Egyptologist Kara Cooney has written about how transitional pharaohs used what she calls image management, the carefully staged performance of kingship, to manufacture authority they did not inherit through blood. Ramesses I may be the clearest example of this in all of Egyptian history. He knew exactly how much time he had. He spent every hour of it building something that would outlast him by generations. His son Seti I would become one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs. His grandson Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, would build temples still standing today, carve statues still filling museums, fight battles still studied in military academies. All of that, every stone, every victory, every golden legacy. It traces back to a 60-year-old administrator who held power for 18 months and left absolutely nothing to chance. And that is the thing mainstream history never quite says out loud. Ramesses the Great was not self-made. He was built by a grandfather who understood that the most powerful thing a leader can do is not conquer. It is engineer the conditions for the person who comes after. Here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because when you go looking for Thutmose I and Ramesses I in the historical record, really looking past the surface level summaries and the encyclopedia entries, what you find is fragments, pieces, half-erased names on broken stones, and the question you are forced to ask is, why? In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was supposed to be eternal, immortal, written into stone for 10,000 years. So why are these two men, the architects of Egypt's most celebrated era, so difficult to find? The answer is one that makes you look at the whole of ancient Egypt differently. In this civilization, memory was not preserved, memory was constructed. The pharaohs who came after, the successful ones, the famous ones, the ones with enough power and longevity to control the record, they decided who existed in the official version of history. They decided whose name was spoken, whose face remained on the wall, whose cartouche survived the chisel. Thutmose I's legacy was partially rewritten by his daughter Hatshepsut, who claimed the throne for herself, then contested by her successor Thutmose III, who tried to erase Hatshepsut in turn. The records from this period are confused, layered, deliberately blurred, a palimpsest of competing political needs. Ramesses I appears in so few contemporary monuments that for decades, scholars debated almost every detail of his reign from administrative records and his son's later inscriptions. A pharaoh reconstructed almost entirely through absence. These men were not forgotten by accident. They were placed in shadow by those who came after, successors who needed to appear as the true source of power, not inheritors of someone else's machine. The Egyptians had a concept for this. They called it the death of the name, when no one speaks your name anymore, when your face is erased from the wall, when your cartouche is cut from the stone, when the priests stop including you in the offerings. That is the final death, the one that cannot be undone. And both Thutmose I and Ramesses I came dangerously close to it. Not through military defeat, not through incompetence, but through success. They built systems so strong that their successors outgrew the need to credit them. They engineered transitions so smooth that nobody needed to acknowledge the engineer. The greatest builders of Egypt's golden age were buried by the golden age they created, and somewhere in that irony is a truth about power and memory that reaches far beyond the ancient Nile. So what do we actually walk away with from all of this? Three things. The first, every golden age has a shadow behind it. The eras we celebrate, the great empires, the iconic names, the moments that fill the museums, they do not emerge from nothing. They are built, stone by stone, by people who often receive no credit for the building. Someone always did the hard, unglamorous, sometimes ruthless work before the glory arrived. The second, legitimacy is manufactured, not inherited. Thutmose I had no royal blood. Ramesses I had no dynasty. Both of them understood that authority is not something you are given. It is something you construct through action, through image, through the relentless performance of power until the performance becomes the reality. Modern psychology has a name for this. The Egyptians had a civilization built on it. And the third thing, the one I keep coming back to, these men were not gods. They were human beings, operating under impossible pressure, with incomplete information, in a world that was actively trying to fall apart around them. And they held it together, with intelligence, with calculation, with a clear-eyed understanding of what survival actually requires. That is not the story carved on the temple walls, but it is the true story of how Egypt endured. The bone fragment in Cairo that may or may not be Thutmose I, the fragmented stele with the half-erased name of Ramesses I. These are not relics of failure. They are the fingerprints of men who did something extraordinary, and then had the extraordinary misfortune of doing it so well that the world stopped needing to remember them. So I am asking you to remember them now. Thutmose I, Ramesses I, the shadow kings who built the golden age. And now I want to hear from you. Which pharaoh do you believe history has most unfairly erased, and why? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment.